much, Anne. Thank you all for being here. It's such an honor and a privilege to speak to you. As Anne said, I work for the International Secretariat of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And we're privileged to have women in 33 countries to keep our movement going. We think of ourselves far more than being an organization with a movement. We're the oldest women peace movement in the world, and we have volunteers, thousands of volunteers around the world who believe in the vision, in the feminist, anti-militarist vision that we have and would like to take it forward. And I know that the theme of the festival this year is about migration. By no means I'm a specialist in migration, but I'd like to speak to you about how we at WILF tackle migration from the roots. How do we want migration not to be the only fleeing and displacement, not to be the only option for people in conflict countries. So Anne generously offered me to do a presentation, but I thought we'd love this to be a discussion. We have so much to learn and so much to know from your views about what we do. So please jump in at any minute, ask questions, tell me your thoughts. This is more of an open discussion for all of us, hopefully to know a little bit more about what we at WILF do, but also how you look at it and how you think of it. So for those of you who are not WILF members yet, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our history and how we came here. And I'm really, we have Helen, who's our historian and who has been keeping our history going, and please pick one of our leaflets which says a lot about the development of WILF. I'm going to take you through it very, very briefly, but if you have any questions, we're very privileged to have Helen here with us. The movement started in 1915 when 1,300 women came from all around the world to The Hague to try and stop World War I. You can imagine how hard it was back then to go from one country to another, from one continent to another, and for women at that time, most of them didn't have the right to vote. Most of them come from the suffragette movement, and they went and tried to take proactive action against war. The war still happened, but these women brought their ideas together and started the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And it's a feminist, anti-militarist vision that is saying we cannot wait for wars to happen to stop them and to find solutions for all the problems they make. What we need is to tackle the root causes of war and to stop these before many, many people die. Now, 101 years later now, and 2 world wars, many, many agonies, we believe that the vision of WILF has never been needed so much. Everything that those progressive, extremely insightful women realized 101 years ago stands exactly the same now, only weapons are more developed, their killing abilities are far higher, their impact on civilians are insurmountable. Back then, in early 1900s, 1 civilian would die for every 9 combatants. Today, 11 civilians die for every 1 combatant. So the war just came to where we live, to schools, to hospitals, to our houses, and we cannot afford not to take action against it. It's not only those who choose to take part. So we believe that it's our duty to first assess how this war is impacting people differently. We know it's impacting civilians differently by numbers. But how do we know how it's impacting women differently? We take it upon ourselves, we in many organizations, feminist organizations around the world, to assess this impact and to see what can be done about it from the roots, not after these hostilities happen. Today, WILF is, as I said, what started as a group of women in The Hague. Today we're in 33 countries, Every single one of them is volunteers. There's a very, very few staff in Geneva and New York, where our international secretariat and our second office, and they're in these two cities because we hope to impact and influence decision makers in these two capitals. In Geneva, as you know, there's the Human Rights Council and most treaty bodies, and in New York there's the Security Council and the rest of treaty bodies. And at 12 we have 4 programs, and what we do is we have a Reaching Critical Will program, which is our disarmament program. We try to monitor the use of arms per country, but also per arm. So we monitor how the arms are developing and how are they being used, who are they impacting, and what can be done about them. We also do a lot of research on arms and how they impact different groups differently. And I'm going to give you a few examples of some of our findings. So, for example, recently there's, and I know you can see here, about a protest on the use of on the attacks in Syria. I'm Syrian, and in Syria and in a few countries, there's this trend of the use of explosive weapons in highly populated areas. They no longer bomb; they use bombs and barrel bombs and other very explosive weapons, and they use them in populated areas under all sorts of excuses. So we at 12 went and researched how do these have a gendered impact. Who is at home when men are fighting? Who is in markets and in schools and around very highly populated areas? And if they're not the actual targets of these weapons, how do they impact them in a different way? And the findings were quite horrifying. One of the findings, for example, is that women might not be the highest number of victims of such arms, but 80% of death during pregnancy and delivery could have been prevented if women could make it to healthcare centers. These numbers you wouldn't get at the victims count. They don't tell you that. They tell you 5,000 men died, 1,000 women died, but they don't tell you that many, many thousands of women are dying because they cannot reach healthcare and they need it differently. They won't tell you that, for example, in besieged areas, women are the last to eat, they eat least, they make all the food, they look for food, and so on. So this sort of gendered impact is almost always overlooked. And we try to look at it just to say we have everything to gain from the control of arms. We also lobby against the development of new arms. One of our biggest campaigns is the campaign against nuclear weapons, and we are achieving great successes very recently. Now the resolutions on nuclear weapons are being discussed in Geneva, and we had an influence on that. We also are trying to stop the efforts to develop what we call killer robots, which are self-directed weapons where there's no human involved at any point of the use of these arms. And in the campaigns against drones and the use of drones and so on. So that's what we try to do on the armament part. We also work on human rights. We lobby for a gendered, anti-militarist vision of the development of laws, but also of decisions made in treaty bodies and elsewhere. And I'm going to give you some examples from our work in crisis response. We also have a department that works on women, peace and security, the 1325 resolution of the UN Security Council, which says that women lay at the heart of peace building and peacekeeping. And we cannot overlook the role of women in shaping the peace building process, both their efforts but also the way they're impacted by it. It's a very important resolution, and the feminist movement and women organizations around the world have been trying to build on it. It's 16-year-old now. It's nowhere near where we would like it to be in implementation. And then there's the 4th program, which I work in, called the crisis response. And it's the newest. The organization is 101-year-old, and our program is only 4 years old. And it only came, it developed organically after the Arab Spring and also other very recent conflicts, where we realized that part of what we do very well at WILF is feminist movement building. We support women groups that in conflict areas and in other countries to actually be able to organize, coordinate, make a difference nationally on the local level. So the program started as a small MENA project, at least in North Africa, where we started making mapping and analyzing and partnering with organizations in the Middle East and North Africa who are trying to do exactly what we do, analyze the impact on women and also work together to have bigger role in peacekeeping and peace building. Now we have a project in Bosnia, where we work with women who reorganized after 20 years of the Dayton Agreement to see what went right and what went wrong and transfer these experiences to women in other contexts. We have a program in Ukraine where we are very proud that we managed to go to Ukraine and analyze and work with women organizations quite early on in when the conflict seemed to be starting. And now we're studying a program in Colombia. We have a section in Colombia who's done great work over the past 4 years on the peace agreement. And we're trying to support them through our crisis response department. So in the crisis response department, everything that I've just mentioned about our work in disarmament and in peace building has been really, it's amazing to see how it happens locally. And how is this related to migration and is quite organic, but also I found it very fascinating. What Western Europe is trying to look at backwards, in our opinion, they're trying to deal with the consequences, is what we found women to be dealing with quite early on, when they are root causes. They're trying to deal with the massive armament movement. They're trying to deal with the use of explosive weapons. They're trying to deal with the many people who are young men mainly, who are forced into no option but being fighters. They're trying to create other options for them. They're trying to influence their own children and children who they have access to as mothers and sisters and as really change makers in the society, to see, first inform them that they have other options, but also to use their energy and power towards something good, to break what we call is breaking the cycle of violence. And this is not only the visible violence, they also break the cycle of war economy. In countries like Yemen, for example, or Libya or Syria, where suddenly the entire economy is either based on arming or based on aid. Both of them are a part of the cycle of war economy. And women try to break this cycle. They try to make people's income and people's livelihood separate from that of war, so they can make choices whether they want to be involved or not. Now, unfortunately, in countries where there's huge use of explosive weapons mainly, where the lives of civilians is never spared, we face high displacement rate. People flee in the hundreds of thousands in very, very short time. And it's quite ironic that they call it the refugee crisis in Europe, because the crisis mainly is in neighboring countries. Pakistan had to deal with millions of refugees, and so did Syria around the Iraq war, and so does the countries around Syria now, and so do Yemenis who have to flee. What I want to say is that it is the crisis, if there's a crisis in all the displacement issue, first it's for people who have to leave everything they know. They have to leave their houses, a place where they probably never imagined living in their entire life. Unprepared and with no contingency, with no plans. And then it's a crisis to hosting communities around the country who were never prepared. They haven't been able to accommodate their own people. I'm speaking in the north of Jordan and in Iraq and in Syria before the conflict, and in Lebanon now. Lebanon, for example, has at least 1.5 million refugees, when the entire population is 4 million. So every fourth person is a Syrian. And the country already didn't have enough ways to deal with their own population issues. They don't have enough services, they have their own political turmoil and so on. And then obviously it is a crisis to countries who are hosting refugees from very, very far away. We found that the media failed to reflect what are the agonies of these displaced people, of the host community around them, and also why do they leave their countries. There's parts of it that quite one would think are very clear. Who would put their children in a boat where the chances of surviving are 50-50 if being where they're coming from was not more dangerous, where their chances were not less. But not only that, it's all the network that they're losing, the security that comes from the society and from people around them, especially in places that wasn't developed enough to be individualized. And by that I mean, when I moved from Syria to the UK, I realized that my need to communicate with people is far less. I can find everything on the internet. I don't need to call people to give me suggestions on things, and I can do almost everything on my own, which is quite developed. It's because of development of services. In small local places where are now under conflict, it's not like that at all. The community provides a lot of support, provides a lot of base for people. So what women groups are trying to do is to strengthen this when the state fails to provide a safe ground for its own people. Like the case in Syria, where the state is attacking its own people, like the case in Yemen, where the state completely failed to protect their people from attack by another country, like in Libya, and so on. These are some of the countries we work in, and it takes different shapes, but very similar consequences in other countries, where there's a military crackdown, like Egypt, where there was a political turmoil, like Tunisia. So what we found is that women groups are trying to create and strengthen this local support system to make survival possible, but also to change everything that war imposing. And some of the examples we found is like women groups, for example, in Syria, in one of the refugee camps in Otme, a displaced camp actually, so it's inside the Syrian borders. The use of arms increased significantly in the past few years because the state gave up its role of ensuring any rule of law. And women used one incident where there has been a disagreement where all men are armed, and they required that they've done a campaign inside the displacement camp, and they required that no arms are used in public places. And this is one of the very few ones that we could analyze. Actions done by women organically, they're not pushed by any ideological background, rather than their safety, their ability to monitor how their security and the security of their families would look like. And they said, we want to disarm. And that applies in the local settings, but it also applies in an international settings. And here I talk about peace agreements and how we have monitored and seen peace agreements happening. And you all must have heard about the movement, the feminist movements asking for women participation in peacemaking and peacekeeping and in negotiations. Part of it is quite straightforward. Any decision that's done without women would not be reflecting the needs of the entire society. Definitely true. But there's another depth to this, especially in peace agreements, where the current style of peace talks and peace agreements, unfortunately, is becoming the room where men with arms who control territory sit after they're tired of many years of conflict. It's not peace building, it's not negotiating a peace as much as it is an attempt to get those exhausted men to share the cake differently. And unfortunately, because women are very rarely armed, they very rarely control territory, we end up with them not on the table, because what it takes to be on that table is not your role in society, it's your role in making war. And we have seen so many so many peace negotiations around the world where women were completely missing. And there's a friend, an academic, a fantastic academic called Tanya Paffenholz, who sat and analyzed peace processes in 40 different conflicts in the past 10 years. And she wasn't hoping to do a gender analysis. That wasn't one of the things she wanted to do when she started this study. But then she found out that conflict where women were involved were more likely to actually not fall apart. They were more likely to be, far more likely to be implemented, and they were definitely more focusing on the human security, on the security of individuals, on services. We saw it in those peace processes that are actually open and public. You see men discussing, and I'm not making a stereotype, I'm speaking about men who are basically warlords or have been actively involved in the conflict. And they sit and discuss, what do I get and what do you get, and how much arms can we make out of you, and what territory would I be controlling, and what positions would I get. And then when women come to the table, having not been part of the war, part of the action of war, they ask, when do we return to our country? When do the millions of refugees come back and those displaced go back to their houses? When do the schools open? When do the services are provided again? And what are we doing about reconstruction? That's not a suggestion that women don't have a stake in war. I'm sure many of you are thinking of examples where women held arms and took active role in hostilities, but that hasn't been a systematic case at all, especially in the countries we work in. What has been happening is that this war is imposed on them in every shape and form, and they're even denied a way of making things different. So back to some of the examples we have seen. They work a lot on the local level, but they also try through many partners around the world, through we call it the sisterhood, we call the support, the amazing support they get, for example, from WILF volunteers and members around the world who are happy to go to the streets and demonstrate.